charged with building an organization that represents the state of Montana's interests, the people's interests of the state. And so I feel, connected in vicarious ways to the various communities where we have members and where we have board leadership. And it was clear to me after the police actions and the street actions in the aftermath of the Hells Angels that we needed to be very careful as we approached showing this movie to make sure that it was received and presented in a context that was constructive and productive. And I sought out the leadership from the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center because I've got a lot of respect for them and the work they do, and because we share something in common, and that's a link to Jeanette Rankin. Some of you who are young may not know that Jeanette Rankin was the first congresswoman from Montana elected before most states were letting women vote at all. And when she represented us in Washington, she was opposed to the U.S. entry into the First World War. And at the same time, oddly enough, the American Civil Liberties Union was in its birth. The people who were opposing the First World War exercised their First Amendment rights to assemble and to speak, and were, in some cases, summarily deported without the benefit of due process. And Jeanette Rankin stood up with a core of other people to found the American Civil Liberties Union. She was the first vice president of the national organization. She was at the table when the organization grew out of the American Union Against Militarism and became the American Civil Liberties Union. So that little bit of history ties us together. ACLU has grown. We've ended up defending anti-war protesters, but we've also had to defend the rights of people like the Nazis to be able to march or assemble. And that's a difficult one for some people to understand, but the essence is this, that if the Constitution doesn't defend the least of us, it won't defend the rest of us. And we have tried our best as a union to remain neutral on the content of the people whose rights we represent. And that sets us apart, and it gives us the odd privilege of representing anti-war protesters, but also people like Ollie North. While we didn't agree with what he did with the whole Iran-Contra deal, he was being forced to testify against himself, and that right against self-incrimination has to stand for all of us, or it doesn't stand for any of us. So we've had a broad spectrum of people we've represented over the years. There have been a few people from the incidents of late July and early August who have contacted our office and asked for legal representation. And I just need to tell you that we don't enter into any of this quickly. We enter into it democratically. Our legal panel has reviewed the complaints. They've made recommendations. Our board will meet in another 2 weeks and decide whether or not our organizational resources are best spent being engaged representing the people that have come forward. There's other avenues, political avenues, educational avenues that might be pursued. So we've paid a lot of attention to what's happened over the last couple of weeks, and I've learned a lot about Missoula by attending the various hearings that have been going on. And I realize that the community has a lot of healing to do. At the same time, I don't think anybody should back down from their First Amendment rights to not remain silent. We have an obligation as citizens to speak our minds, and I think if there's any message that comes through this film this evening, that's one of the loud and clear ones. Well, the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center committee wanted us to operate under this statement of purpose for the discussion this evening. And I will read this to you just briefly, and my hunch is that we will stray from it some because we want all of you to participate, and we want our three panelists to share some of their thoughts. But we'll open it up to questions in just a minute. But here is the premise upon which we entered into cooperating this evening about promoting this film. While the film celebrates radicalism, it also brings to thought the tactics of public protest, and how these tactics may arise out of necessity. The panel will consider some of the ways in which citizens direct the values and actions of their government, in particular, in the many ways in which our communities can prepare for cooperation and engagement rather than confrontation. We would hope that the panelists will focus on discussing various models for engagement, cooperation, and responsible citizen oversight of our government. The film provides us with one experience, and the panelists with their experience, which are all thoughtful resources for defining our future. So with that, I guess I would open it up to our panel. And I assume that everybody knows everybody up here.
No.
But, okay. Well, Bill Chalutka has been an activist for many years in this community. Janet Robideau is a leader in Native Action here in town and has a long-standing relationship with the police department here and helping. I don't need it to sound anyway. I'm going to leave it at that. Janet can explain it, and Stu Albertine met earlier. So let me just start out with each of you. The rather dramatic admonition at the end of the film statement was that young people need to carry forward the politics of protest. What do you think about that, and wherever else you want to go with it? I want to give you each a chance to talk, and then I'm hoping that each of you, if you will direct your questions, stand up when you want to speak, and direct your questions up here. I'll try to repeat it. We don't have microphones for the room, so let's start with that. Anybody want to volunteer?
I don't want to say much because I think we should respond to questions and comments, but I don't think there's any reason why old people can't demonstrate and protest action. I think one of the criticisms that people had talking about the Vietnam War was that there were old men sending younger men to battle, and I think we first ought to change the genders and then scramble the generations there. But we can talk more about that. There are a number of hats that I could wear in the discussion, but I guess the one that I'd like to at least start wearing is as a scholar who has studied the demonstration, the political form, the demonstration, social movements, and some of the stuff that's depicted in the movie. I think that might be an interesting role for me to take here, but we can see where the discussion takes us.
First of all, y'all have to wish me happy birthday. Today's my birthday. I'm 29 in a couple of years. My daughter took me out to dinner, so I did not get a chance to see this movie, but I was thinking about this, and one of the things, I actually attended some anti-war protests right here in Missoula in the 70s when I was running around here. And I just wanted to preface something by saying when we were talking about the police action that happened here during Hell's Angel weekend, if you talk to us as Indian people, one of the things we said is we go through that all the time with our cops on the reservation. Our folks are beaten and tormented, and they don't always have, they certainly don't have the ability to protest like we do here. This is one of the reasons why I live here. But I agree with Bill Chalutka that, that old people, not me of course, but old people can also protest. And I do agree that we need to, this is something that I strongly believe is a freedom that we have, and that is to step forward and let folks know when we're not happy with what is going on. And when you think of other countries that aren't allowed that privilege, we're really lucky. And I think about people who die in protests, and it isn't anything that I would readily give up. And I really like them because it's coming together and letting folks that know that we're standing together. Now, you may take me out by myself, but when all of us stand together, you know, they can't take us out, or they have a much harder time doing it.
Is this, nope, not working.
Is there a button on it?
Here we are. The gift of speech. Well, I'm a 60s radical who's just entered his own personal 60s, just last December 4th. And I still march and I still protest. And so did Abby, really up to the end. But he does make a point in there, in the movie, in that speech. There is something about being young and generating and developing new ideas, a certain kind of imagination, and a certain willingness to take chances that, well, when you get older and you have a few kids and a family and some arthritis, you're slightly less likely to want to go in that direction. So what he's pointing out there, and which I do agree with, that it's very important for this generation, the next generation, the younger generation, to develop their own forms of protest, their own leaders, their own styles. And I'll be glad to march along.
I'm going to be a moderator and not throw in my 2 cents worth till the end. Try to do my best to just be a traffic cop here tonight. So we're open to hearing from you all about the film, about the role of protest, about whatever you think is germane here. If any of you want to speak, I'd appreciate your standing up and letting us, you know, try to identify you one at a time. Yes, please.
I'm curious, at what point do you think people feel that they are taking the streets for a legitimate cause? In a sense, when do we decide that our government isn't representing us, and therefore justified to take to the streets? Would you just take this? I mean, it's thinking in terms of initiating these street theater tactics.
The question, if you couldn't volunteer, was at what point are we justified taking to the streets? What makes an issue of that magnitude? Putting words in your mouth saying that. Go ahead.
I just briefly, the question of legitimacy is an interesting one to raise in the context of Abbie Hoffman, who did a lot of things which brought his own legitimacy into question in an attempt to really undermine the legitimacy of the things he was protesting against. In other words, part of the reason Abbie Hoffman is so interesting, it seems to me, is that, let's see if the bottle will go all the way down, is that part of the reason that he's interesting is that he did not enact the power, he did not reenact the power that he was opposing. He was not somber, he quit dressing in a tie and quit cutting his hair pretty quickly. And he believed clearly, and the movie shows this, he believed that the forces arrayed against him were so overwhelming that rather than replace them, they first had to be made uneasy, and new ways to attract a community of protest had to be developed. And I think those are some of the things he did. Now, you're asking, was that legitimate, or is that legitimate? There are a set of strategic and tactical questions any protester has to deal with for himself or herself, and legitimacy would be one of those questions. There are others. I don't wish to take the role of the sort of God figure social scientist who says this was a legitimate and that was not a legitimate one. I think that's a tricky question to answer, and I don't want to leap to it.
Can we let the other people answer, and then you can ask another question? Is that all right?
I just want to say for us, and I remember back when I first joined the American Indian movement back in 1973, and that was a militant movement, much different than what I do today. But for us, in my work today, when we take stuff to the streets, there's a number of things that we've done that lead up to that. And it's a show of power, and it's not something that we do just immediately right off the bat. There's things that we do, including building our organization and giving people a sense of their own power, and it's a fun thing to do together, because it's not easy to stand out there by yourself and screech at the cops, but when you're doing it in a group of 50, or a nursing home administrator, or a legislator, or a school system, or whatever. But I know before we do anything like that, that there's a number of steps that we take before we take it to the streets.
The question of legitimacy and protest and rebellion is one that's haunted political theorists and writers going back to Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and they never came up with an answer. There is no objective answer. There is no objective answer. You really have to, each individual has to look into themselves and find the answer. The answer is inside of you. It doesn't exist in some objective way. Now, in the 60s, we considered the war to be unconstitutional. So I suppose that was a way of legitimizing the rebellion, an illegal war. Racism and segregation seemed to be blatantly unconstitutional. So that was a way of legitimizing that. But some protests might be against situations that are constitutional, but they're just wrong. So you have to find it in yourself, and you have to find the appropriate form of protest that suits you. And if that creates a somewhat anarchic and chaotic society, good.
Someone had a follow-up after I spoke.
Ma'am, do you want to ask Bill what you wanted to ask?
The thing was, I believe the gentleman in front of me, when he asked his question, asked a different question than what Bill answered, so I was hoping the rest of the panel would address it with his point of view. At what time, or at what causes,
It's not whether an issue is legitimate or not.
right, not the form of protest.
It's about the structure. That we have a government, allegedly, that's a representative government. At what point do we decide that our government, what do you go through before you decide that our government itself isn't legitimate, and therefore we must take matters into our own hands, such as going out into the streets?
Well, what usually happens is people try to work within the system. Generally speaking, this movie you saw tonight, you see me getting my head cracked open a few times and tear gassed. That's not fun. So I started out working within the system. In the presidential election between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, I thought Lyndon Johnson was the peace candidate, and I supported it. Then he expanded the war. And then in my eyes, the whole representative democratic system broke down. Lyndon Johnson was the peace candidate. He denounced Barry Goldwater as a warmonger, and then he expanded the war. So at that point, I went into the streets, and I took my chances. Different people do it at different times, but most people start out going through the system. It's only when the system doesn't listen, when the system betrays people, that they get motivated to more extreme forms of protest. You read history, you'll see that's true.
I know of no compelling set of rules that will organize everyone in the community. There will be some people who will find all protest illegitimate, even if it's in self-defense over purely physical issues. And we heard some of that at the community hearings the other evening on the university campus. Some people felt that protest was illegitimate even if one was protecting one's person and health and well-being. That we would call that a hard definition. You know, that's taken a tough line. So lacking a universal rule that could be applied, it really is what the community talks about. Was that okay? And was that an appropriate response? And Abby Hoffman was obviously a genius at getting the community talking about it. You know, was it all right to throw those dollar bills off of the balcony in Wall Street? I mean, that showed a lot of disrespect. But it also it got people talking. And of course, his position was that you almost couldn't pay enough disrespect to Wall Street. So that sort of takes care of the problem from his perspective. I think briefly, I think sociologically, one of the things that's interesting about the 60s and the protests is that the participants and Stuart and others, myself peripherally, folks felt a genuine sense of distress and urgency, which was extraordinary. And I think it probably was because it was a very youthful movement. There was a really significant gap between the generations. You wouldn't have been able to get a panel with the ages represented up here on the stage, speaking in a friendly way about Abby Hoffman in Missoula or much of any place else until somewhere along in the 1970s. And I think that heightened the sense of urgency and distress. Do I think it was excessive? No, I don't think it was excessive. But I can understand that other people might argue differently. I think one of the questions that some of the reviews of the movie have already raised is the extent to which Abby Hoffman generated the resentment politics that obviously followed, and I think it's a legitimate question, but clearly the movie raises the question that J. Edgar Hoover and Hoover's approach, and despite Hoffman's paranoia, Hoover was a malign force of astonishing proportions. There are a couple of good biographies now you should read if you're not familiar with him. In a sense, Hoover creates Hoffman and Hoffman creates Ronald Reagan, and that happens in politics all the time.
I have a follow-up. This question of legitimacy brings up a pretty obvious follow-up question. The undifferentiated mass of the American people, how do you challenge them? We have a range of you guys have all been through the decades, several decades, and I'm interested to see how you compare and contrast the mass of American people that needed to be motivated back then with now maybe.
If you couldn't hear the question in the back, it's how do you motivate the mass of the American people, and how is that different from decades past compared to with today? And I think Abby.
Between now and then.
Anybody want to add that?
Well, I don't. We didn't succeed in doing it in the '60s. We motivated and mobilized a very large minority of the population. But Ronald Reagan never would have been president if we had succeeded in mobilizing the majority. So I hope this time around we do find ways to mobilize the majority. I think since we saw a movie about Abby Hoffman and the Yippies tonight, I will say what the Yippies threw into the pot, pot. The sense that you could be very serious about your purpose without being boring, without being dry, that you could be whimsical, imaginative, witty, funny, creative, festive, and still be really serious, really putting it on the line. These guys wound up indicted by the federal government. You don't get there unless you're serious, and the government recognizes that. But I think certain things like running a pig for president, throwing money at stockbrokers, some things they didn't show in the movie, throwing soot at polluters, Con Edison in New York, their executives. And I ran for sheriff of Alameda County in the early 1970 as a protest candidate and carried the city of Berkeley. It's true, it's in the record book. That's fun. And a lot of people liked it. A lot of people liked it. So what I would say when we say, well, how do you mobilize the majority? I don't know exactly how to do it, but I know not with a boring movement.
I would just add 2 cents here, and that's that, I mean, ACLU is known for representing the rights of the minorities. And most of the social movements in this country have been started by minorities and oftentimes carried by minorities. So, I mean, the majority rule works, you know, to get people elected. That's, you know, every year we go through that process and we elect the best of what's out there, people who are willing to give that sort of public service. And I encourage you to register if you haven't to vote this fall, because those decisions are important. But then people still have to hold those people accountable and try to help them see that it's not just, you know, the most phone calls that they get that's going to dictate what sort of things they vote for or against, that they have got to also understand as leaders they have a role to listen to the message, not just the number of faxes that are generated or the number of emails that they get telling them to vote one way or another. So minority rights are very important, and minority movements are very important, and minorities have shaped politics in this country forever, and they probably will continue to. I've got a couple here, and we'll get to you. Go ahead.
In the film, and in a lot of the high-profile issues of the ACLU has taken on, First Amendment issues, freedom of speech, association, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment stuff pops up a lot. You see a lot of abuses of those, you know, in the film and in look at history. There's criticism in some areas of ACLU for their apparent lack of interest or dealing with the Second Amendment issues. And so, do you think that's valid, and where does this Second Amendment bear arms type of thing come into our consideration?
Okay, well,
You're going to have to take that.
I'm happy to take it. I'm just, I hope that this doesn't become ACLU defending its positions this evening, but I'm open to that if that's where it goes. This question was, we saw a lot of First Amendment and Fourth and Fifth Amendment violations during the course of the movie, and that ACLU takes a lead on those. Where are we on the Second Amendment? You know, we do a radio show in eastern Montana, and we did one on each element of the Bill of Rights each month during the last year. And I would say virtually every show we had people calling saying, what about the Second Amendment? So you're in good company. There's a lot of people that think about that in this state, all over the country, I guess. ACLU affiliates can disagree with the national organization, and often do. The national organization has taken the position that it is that the Second Amendment calls for a collective right to bear arms under a well-regulated militia. That's not a carte blanche acceptance of every type of weapon can be in every person's hands, that you can have reasonable restrictions about registration or ownership as long as, well, that's the Nationals' position. Our affiliate has never been able to agree on a position. And I'll tell you, I mean, I had a librarian who you think of as, the defenders of intellectual freedom, who was a pistol expert and who defended the Second Amendment as fervently as she did the First Amendment. But you do have ACLU affiliates around the country where violence in the community is such that they've taken positions supporting some limitations on handguns. I think you need to know, though, that when there are excesses, we do stand up with the Second Amendment organizations as well. So when Waco happened, we were there with the Second Amendment organization saying this is an example of a government gone berserk, where there is an excessive use of force in response to the problem that was presented, and there were other ways to resolve it, short of calling out the Army. So it's not a simple question, it's not a unanimous question, and I think for all of you that joined ACLU this evening, or who are going to before you leave, you need to know that we don't march lockstep on every issue. If you go to our webpage at aclumontana.org, or if you go to the National at aclu.org, you'll see all of the issues that ACLU takes a position on. Today, for example, remember the Dream March in Washington, D.C., commemorating Martin Luther King's vision of combating racism in our society. ACLU is at the front, as we have been over the last couple of years, in combating driving while black and brown. It links to so many other issues. So other than somebody who works for the organization, I don't know anybody that agrees with all of the positions the organization takes. And you're welcome to come to any of our meetings and see how it takes form in board discussion. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
You're going to have to speak louder.
Oh, okay. Sure. I think it was a really bad thing, whatever organization put out the drugs in the 70s to stop the movement of the 60s. But who the hell is the CIA and who do they work for and why? I just, and whoever might be working for them, why? Who are you working for? It's pretty horrible. And the misinformation, it was pretty awful. They make a lot of good people look bad. And it all plays into the media. It's still happening, and it's more frequent than ever, and people just call you a freak. I mean, people think the CIA is some myth. There's no CIA, and nobody's working for them. But I'll tell you, there are many. But why? And who are those people working for anyway?
The question is about the CIA. Who are they, and who are they working for?
But also mention drugs, and I think the war on drugs was phenomenally important in counteracting the Abbie Hoffman's role and the role of others who tried to follow in that vein. It was obviously something that trapped Abbie himself, and the movie is ambiguous about that event, and from what I know of the history. Ambiguity is probably a good position to take. I don't know anything about that episode, but I do think that the war on drugs is a way to crack down on people who are different, on people who protest, on people who especially are young or black or brown, gay or lesbian. Was an extraordinary tactic and was just stunningly successful, and to the extent that we really have barely started to get rational on that subject yet. And I'm with you. The CIA, the Gary Webb, I think that's a persuasive argument that he made.
Well, and in terms of the question, who is the CIA?
That's the question.
Yeah, who is the CIA?
Who are they working for?
Well, the CIA at its highest levels is nothing more than the American ruling class. And that's true of intelligence agencies all over the world. The social and political elite of the society runs the intelligence agencies. That's true in England, that's true in the United States, it's true everywhere. And the CIA took shape after World War II as America became a world power and its investment empire spread everywhere. The CIA came into existence to protect and defend that empire. And that's very clear cut. That's who they are and what they are. Now, of course, at the lower levels, you have regular employees and people who come out of colleges and study law or study international relations or study a lot of foreign languages, and then the CIA recruits them. But at the highest levels, it's the elite of the society, period.
I would just point out there's a distinction between the CIA and the FBI in terms of where their turf battles are, and the CIA is to operate outside of our shores, and the FBI internally. There was some question during COINTELPRO about the crossing of lines there, and I would recommend, at least if you haven't seen the book called Secrets by Angus McKinsey, it goes into COINTELPRO. He spent the rest of his life, he died of cancer a few years ago, after being busted by COINTELPRO of trying to expose it. And it's a good expose. Yes, sir.
Yes, one speak about legitimacy and protest. By the way, we are not speaking about protest. What the key question, and that has to do with the question about legitimacy, is destabilizing action, agitprop, which is as old as the political world. But don't you think that paradoxically what happened in the 60s, of course not the same time zeitgeist, not the same period, but it's paradoxically it's less possible now in spite of the liberal veneer of the state. And what happened to Missoula a few weeks ago is just that Missoula was behind the time. Postmodernity is catching up with Missoula. And what happened with the repression, the liberal mask of the city, of the organic, of the community, we all together, poor and rich, it falls down. And what you have the pure repression of the state, of the institution. And if you think that you can protest when the political body of the state has been streamlined by capital in such a way that destabilization is not possible anymore. Look, Giuliani, what happened in New York, he has cleaned New York. There's such a presence of the police, at least in the US. I mean, what kind of destabilization you can effectuate? You have the telesurveillance, you have this whole apparatus which is making it impossible for real destabilization. The US has the highest carceral population in the world. I don't know if you know that, because that means a lot.
Could you hear that back there? Thank you. I think if I can summarize that the level of the apparatus of the government is so much more sophisticated than it was in the 60s that the agitprop tactics won't work anymore. Is that a rough summary? And you guys can pick up on that.
One of the things about protest is that it's not permanently with us. It ebbs and flows. I don't want to call it a cycle, but it goes away for a while and then it comes back. And I think you're right. The authority is much more sophisticated. There's some fractures sometimes in the community of citizens that maybe weren't there in the 1960s. I think the situation changes a great deal. The battle in Seattle, I think, is a heartening event that all of us should be paying a lot of attention to, and much of that was reenacted, although not covered nearly as well, in Philadelphia during the Republican convention, in Los Angeles during the Democratic convention. There are communities of protest. There's folks associated with them in the room tonight. There are communities of protest that are mobilizing people, frankly, in a clear-headed and straightforward way that Abbie Hoffman was better as a showman, I think. The Ruckus Society, for example, is better at the systematic, one foot after the next foot development of communities of protest. It's astonishing what they're doing. And so, sure, government gets more sophisticated and the folks who wish to destabilize it need to grow and figure that out. And politics is always this act and response. It's a call and response game. It's always you're always linked to the people you're protesting against. You're trying to figure them out, trying to destabilize them, trying to make your points to the larger audience.
I just, I feel out of place here because here's a professor and here's Stuart, who is right in the midst of with Abby Hoffman. But I have to say this, that I'm just a person. I'm just a citizen living here in Missoula, Montana. And our folks are just fighting to survive on a day-to-day basis. We don't think about destabilization. We don't think about, the CIA. We're just trying to get by. And what we do is mobilize people to let them voice their opinion, to bring them together, to let them know when we're angry. So I'm just like sitting here going, I feel like a first grader who just got pushed into a college classroom, so.
Well, I'll tell you, if Abby were here tonight, I'll speak for him and say, I agree with you. That was Abby's politics, basically. He didn't formulate any great ideologies or great abstractions. He just said, well, where are people at? And they should fight. They should fight for where they're at and what they need. And so that's Abby's politics in a nutshell.
We've got a bunch of hands here, so we're going to just start and work our way up here. Go ahead.
Just a brief question. I'd like to direct it to Stu, if you don't mind, and it's because you're uniquely qualified on that panel to comment, Stu, and if it's an uncomfortable question, I apologize. Do you have any comment about whether or not Abby's death was a suicide?
Question was, does Stu have any question that Abby's death was a suicide?
Well, you heard earlier about how not everybody in the American Civil Liberties Union agrees on every subject. Among Abby's friends, there's a diversity of opinion on that question. For instance, the venerable Dave Dellinger, who has a brief appearance in the movie, now in his mid-80s and just got back from being a guest of the Japanese peace movement, just returned to the States, and still going at it in his mid-80s, an example to us all. Dave believes that Abby was murdered. And there are others who do. Sad to say, I do believe Abby committed suicide. There's evidence of it. There was an earlier attempt at a failed suicide that everybody knows happened. And then his letters preceding his death show that he had fallen into a very deep state of despair. Now, what isn't generally known is that he had a doctor who changed his medication to Prozac. And some of us think that perhaps that was a medical error and the Prozac contributed to it. Then I would add that my old friend Bobby Seale, the Black Panther you see in the movie being chained and gagged, and by the way, that really did happen in Chicago. Bobby actually thinks it might have been an accidental death. So there's just a diversity of opinions. There was no suicide note, and I guess we'll never know. I like the way the movie handled it. Just simply said, well, the coroner reported it was a suicide. Not taking a position, really.
Yes, in the red shirt.
I'd like to refer to the final scene of this film, which seems to show Abby Hoffman taking claim along with his fellow 60s activists for ending the treatment of women as second-class citizens. And I'd like to juxtapose that with scenes of his self-involved womanizing in this film and stories that I've certainly heard a lot about such things in the 60s, and I'm just kind of curious, Stu specifically, what your memories are of the white male hetero world working in the 60s to end treatment of women whenever this should happen, ending the treatment of women as second-class citizens.
The question for those in back was the Abbey taking credit and the 60s protesters taking credit for women's liberation, and how that really jived with the reality of the interaction of the white male hetero world at the time. Is that fair? And aimed at Stu, of course.
Naturally. Well, first, it would be really much better if my wife were here tonight to answer that question, because she has written about it. But tonight she couldn't make it because she's in Boulder, Colorado, at a Planned Parenthood conference. But Abby, in that scene, is not personally taking credit for the women's movement. That would be absurd. But he is saying that the 60s rebellion played a major role in generating the modern day women's movement. Then it was called women's liberation movement, then it came to be called feminism. And that's true, historically. Let me finish. You asked the question before you jump down my throat. And to give a point of departure, one of the early yippies was an individual named Robin Morgan. Robin then went on to be one of the founders of Ms. Magazine. And certainly everyone would acknowledge one of the founders of the women's liberation movement. The spirit of protest is saying no second-class citizens in America, starting with the civil rights movement, going into the peace movement, the counterculture, certainly stimulated the development of the women's movement. Now, what about individuals like Abby, womanizing? Absolutely. What? Oh yeah, well, exactly. We all grew up in America, and we rebelled against it. I grew up in America in the 40s and 50s in the rather somewhat tough streets of Brooklyn. Abby grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. Jerry Rubin grew up in Cincinnati. We grew up in very, very sexist societies, and we were strongly influenced by those attitudes, no doubt, in our behavior, in our lives. And we rebelled against the society, but still continued in many ways to act out the society. But we changed. Abby changed, and I did, and so did a lot of guys I know. So that's what I would say. We weren't saints. This movie does not portray Abby as a saint, and I sure as hell wasn't a saint. And my wife would tell you that right off. But she wasn't a saint either. But we improved. We got better. But yes, I will say this. One of the things that the 60s movement did was created and laid a foundation for the development of the women's movement. And my wife absolutely agrees with that and has written that in a number of essays, and I absolutely would stick with that.
If I can just add something briefly, and I'll try really hard not to be professorial. I agree with the challenge implied by the question completely. I also, because Scott probably won't defend himself, or the Rankin Center might not, I should mention that the folks who put this panel on worked hard to get some diversity on the panel. We're working on it through the afternoon to try and reduce the number of white guys up here. And it didn't work out. But I sympathize. It's an issue. It's an appropriate and legitimate issue. And all I can say is that the folks who put the panel on worked very hard.
We'll take you next. Go ahead.
I was just wondering wondering, from the era that this movie was made, the government was bringing in cocaine to eliminate the poor, and they were using LSD to try to mind altering, mind control or whatever. Well, they've obviously changed their tactics. The cocaine it just kept progressing and it kept getting bigger and bigger, and that's already out of their hands. And it's taking care of itself. They're eliminating each other or whatever. Mind control. They moved on to something else. They moved on to TV. And I agree with you, sister. We are just people, and we need to make our voice be heard. But how do we do that? Since they've obviously changed their tactics, and the average person who's out there protesting isn't nearly as educated enough, as far as psychology and things like that. So how do we change our tactics, and how do we educate people in order to go against that?
The question, if I can paraphrase it, is that there was, the government has gone a couple different ways in how it's used drugs against people or in the community as a tactic. They've changed their tactics. How do we change ours? I'm sorry if I'm not doing justice to your question, but let's see what answers people get from that, if you got something.
I think there's lots of different ways to do this, and I'll refer to something Janet said earlier in the evening about building the organization, and she's a terrific example of somebody who has committed an enormous part of her life to building an organization that wakes up every morning and does this stuff, thinks about it, plans it, talks about it, spreads the word, and there is an organization there. It's going to keep on doing that, and that's one example of ways that people are finding. I mean, there weren't many such organizations, 40 years ago when the events in this movie started.
Just out of the interest, I see some people are starting to peel off, and we're going to do like 2 more questions, and then if people want to just visit informally afterwards, let's do that. But Michelle's been waiting for a long time, and she put up more posters than anybody in Missoula this week, except for the guy that took them down after she put them up. But Michelle, what's your question?
I can read you the city ordinance. I can read the city ordinance that tells you that it's illegal to post posters. So you can talk to me afterwards if you'd like to know that. But as a young person who is very interested in protecting my freedom as a community member, and after watching this movie that depicted Abby Hoffman's life and seeing how he suffered so much, I would like to know what suggestions you have for me, who I want to speak up, and I want to be heard, and I want people to know what I know and share my knowledge with the world. I want to have your suggestions and hear how I can keep myself from suffering, and at the same time sharing my knowledge with other people.
Question is how to get involved, how to stay energetic about it, and not suffer. Let's see what.
Go ahead. Well, a certain amount of suffering is necessary.
Obviously, we suffer because we obviously feel strongly about something, and that's probably because we've been suffering for some reason. I'm going to speak up about it. So how do we speak up without suffering more?
Well, let's say we don't want surplus suffering. We don't want. Well, in getting into Abby's life, this wasn't brought out in the movie, and maybe it's a pity because it could point to an answer for you, possibly. I'm just throwing this out, for consideration. And in fact, I kind of it's sort of I'm thinking on my feet here to a certain extent. But when Abby Hoffman started out, when you see him leafleting, when he's still looking kind of regular, and then even later, he really did not want to become personally famous. His goal was to mobilize people who were dissatisfied with their circumstances and their situation to rebel. As an example of that, when his first book came out, A Revolution for the Hell of It, if you ever get a hold of the original edition of that book, you'll see he didn't use his name. I think the book is by Free. And in fact, later, they show in the movie, when he takes that name Barry Freed, it's F-R-E-E-D, Freed. So he was actually going back to the beginning by taking that last name. So he did not really want to become famous. And then the thing where he became famous was when he was indicted in Chicago in the conspiracy trial, which made him world famous. And of course, he became very influential, and he tried to use his fame to serve his political ideals. But of course, becoming world famous, it then invited incredible amount of persecution. He became a target. So I guess his original approach of trying to organize, trying to mobilize people, but not calling undue attention to yourself is a good way to go. And then try not to get indicted in a federal conspiracy.
There's always a misattribution of arousal that will accommodate that exact situation.
Repeat that.
Okay, misattribution of arousal, you're talking about it. He was targeted. He was arousing people, and therefore he was targeted as arousing people. And it was misattributed to him because he was speaking out. What was really happening is he was speaking out about the mistruths that people were, the misfortunes people were experiencing at the time. And it was attributed to him. And speaking out about it, he was targeted.
Well, I saw the FBI files on this, that are referred to in the movie a lot. I actually read the files, thousands of pages of files. And at the time of the conspiracy trial, I actually saw a memo by J. Edgar Hoover where he's pushing for a trial, and actually Hoover wanted to indict 20 people. They settled for 8 finally. But Hoover says this will be a show trial that we will use to destroy the New Left. And so Abbey was used symbolically. He was used larger than his own life as a symbolic figure. And then the idea was that if you could destroy him, then that would demoralize millions of people who might identify with him at a certain point. So it wasn't just Abbey that was persecuted. I mean, it was kind of the whole generation, in a way, of protesters was persecuted through Abbey. And he suffered for it and was really damaged by it.
How can we avoid it again?
Well, try to keep a low profile and try to let the group you're in be known and the causes you're in be known, and try to keep yourself kind of as much as possible just in the background. Be a background organizer. Now, you may not succeed in doing it. It may be ultimately impossible. But Abbey tried that effort, and maybe we can develop, using the internet allows for a lot of organizing without any individual becoming well known. The new media allows for a lot of forms of organizing that the person doesn't have to make themselves prominent to have an impact and an effect. So I would say, look perhaps to that there and incorporate that into your work. And maybe that'll help.
One other just brief note. J. Edgar Hoover was really committed in a way that was so single-minded as to be really extraordinary in American history, to the idea that history was not moved by cultures or groups, but was moved by individual human beings. And if you read about Hoover at all, you'll run into that idea. He was committed, and if you think it through, there's a very convenient idea for him to have, because he spent a lot of his time hounding individuals as leaders of movements where there were clearly lots more people sharing the idea than just the leader who he was trying to persecute.